The small town of Willow Creek was cloaked in somber silence as residents gathered at St. Mary's Church for the funeral of 24-year-old Ethan Caldwell. Known for his kindness and infectious laughter, Ethan had been a beloved figure in the community. He was the kind of person who always greeted strangers with a smile, helped neighbors carry groceries, and spent weekends volunteering at the local animal shelter. His sudden passing left everyone reeling, but no one felt the weight of his absence more than his mother, Margaret Caldwell. Margaret stood near the casket, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a tissue. Her face was pale, her eyes red from days of crying. She wore a simple black dress that hung loosely on her frail frame, evidence of how much she had withdrawn since hearing the news. Friends and family whispered condolences around her, but their words seemed to bounce off an invisible wall. Margaret didn't respond. She simply nodded or stared blankly ahead. It was clear that nothing could ease the pain gnawing at her heart. Ethan's death had come without warning, a car accident late one rainy night. No one knew exactly what had happened, only that he had lost control of his vehicle on a deserted road outside town. The police report said it was just bad luck, but Margaret couldn't accept that explanation. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. She replayed every detail of the past few weeks in her mind, searching for answers. Had Ethan seemed different before he died? Was there something she missed? A sign? A clue? Anything? As mourners filed past the open coffin to pay their respects, some paused to touch Ethan's cold hand or place flowers beside him. His body lay still, dressed in his favorite blue shirt and tie, looking peaceful yet hauntingly unfamiliar. To Margaret, this wasn't her son. Not really. This version of Ethan was too quiet, too lifeless. Where was the boy who used to laugh so hard he'd cry? Where was the young man who would sneak into the kitchen at midnight to bake cookies just because he felt like it? One by one, people approached Margaret to offer comfort. Some hugged her tightly, others patted her shoulder awkwardly, unsure of what to say. "He's in a better place now," one elderly woman murmured gently. Margaret forced a weak smile but said nothing. Deep down, she resented those hollow phrases. How could anyone claim to know where Ethan was? And why did they think such words would make her feel better? When the service ended, the attendees moved outside to prepare for the burial. The sky above was overcast, heavy gray clouds threatening to spill rain at any moment. A chill swept through the air, making everyone pull their coats tighter around themselves. Margaret lingered behind, staring at the coffin. Everyone assumed she wanted a private moment to say goodbye, so they gave her space. But Margaret wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. Her gaze drifted to the lid of the coffin, which remained partially open. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt an overwhelming urge to close it herself, to seal Ethan away forever. Yet, as she reached out, another thought crossed her mind. What if she opened it wider instead? What if she took one last, long look at her son's face? Hesitation gripped her. Was it morbid to want to see him again? Would it bring her peace, or shatter her completely? Before she could decide, a soft voice broke the silence. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Startled, Margaret turned to see Father Michael standing nearby. His expression was gentle, filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. She nodded quickly, though her heart raced. "I'm fine," she lied. "Just saying goodbye." Father Michael offered her a sad smile. "Take your time. We'll wait." With that, he stepped back, leaving Margaret alone once more. Her hands trembled as she stared at the coffin. Slowly, almost instinctively, she leaned closer. Her fingers brushed against the smooth wood, and then, with a deep breath, she pushed the lid further open. What she saw next froze her blood. It wasn't Ethan, at least not the Ethan she remembered. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she stared into the coffin. Her mind struggled to make sense of what her eyes were seeing. This wasn't Ethan, not the way she remembered him. His face, though eerily calm and untouched by decay, looked different. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but something about his features seemed off. His hair, usually messy and full of life, lay perfectly combed, unnaturally so. His lips were slightly parted, revealing teeth that appeared whiter than they ever had been when he was alive. Even his skin, which should have shown some signs of pallor after death, glowed faintly under the dim light of the church. Her heart pounded violently in her chest. She leaned closer, squinting, trying to convince herself it was just a trick of the lighting or her grief playing tricks on her mind. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. This wasn't her son, or at least not entirely. A wave of nausea washed over her and she stumbled back, clutching her stomach. Her legs felt weak, threatening to give out beneath her. She glanced around frantically, half expecting someone else to notice what she had seen. But the church was empty now, save for Father Michael standing near the doorway, speaking quietly with a few remaining mourners. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Father Michael called out, noticing her distress. "Is everything all right?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention back to the coffin, her hands trembling as she reached out hesitantly. Her fingers brushed against Ethan's forehead, cold and unyielding. A sharp pang of fear shot through her. Something wasn't right. This body, it couldn't be Ethan. Summoning every ounce of courage, Margaret leaned down until her face was inches away from his. That's when she saw it. A faint scar above his left eyebrow. It was barely visible, almost like a scratch, but it sent a jolt of recognition through her. Ethan didn't have a scar there. She would have known if he did. She had patched up countless cuts and scrapes during his childhood. Her mind raced. How could this be? Had there been a mistake at the morgue? Was this someone else's body placed inside her son's coffin? The thought made her sick to her stomach, but it was the only explanation that made sense. Tears blurred her vision as panic set in. She stepped back, her knees buckling. She collapsed onto the floor beside the coffin, gasping for air. The sound drew Father Michael's attention and he rushed over, concern etched across his face. "Margaret!" he exclaimed, kneeling beside her. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak. Her wide eyes darted between him and the coffin, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, she managed to choke out, "It's not him." Father Michael frowned, clearly confused. "What do you mean?" "It's not Ethan," she whispered hoarsely, pointing toward the coffin. "That's not my son." The priest followed her gaze, then hesitated. He rose slowly and approached the casket, peering inside. After a moment, he turned back to her, his expression unreadable. "Margaret," he said gently, "I understand you're grieving, but—" "No," she interrupted sharply, her voice rising. "You don't understand. Look closer. That's not Ethan." Father Michael sighed deeply, his brow furrowing. He knew better than to dismiss her outright. Grief could manifest in strange ways. But he also understood the importance of keeping things calm and respectful. "Let me call someone who can help," he suggested softly. "Perhaps we can double-check with the funeral home to put your mind at ease." Margaret nodded numbly, though her thoughts were spinning wildly. If this wasn't Ethan, then where was he? And why would someone go to such lengths to replace him? As Father Michael stepped away to make the call, Margaret remained seated on the floor, her eyes fixed on the figure in the coffin. Despite her fear, she couldn't tear her gaze away. There was something unsettling about the way the body lay so still, so perfect, as if it weren't meant to move again. And then, without warning, she thought she saw it. A flicker. Just the tiniest twitch of a finger. Her heart stopped. Margaret froze, her breath caught somewhere between terror and disbelief. Had she imagined it? That tiny twitch of a finger. It couldn't have been real. Bodies didn't move after death. It defied everything she knew about life and mortality. Yet, as much as her rational mind screamed that it was impossible, her instincts told her otherwise. She had seen it. Or at least, she thought she had. Her eyes darted toward the coffin again, searching desperately for any sign of movement. The figure inside lay perfectly still, just as before. Nothing seemed out of place. No subtle shifts, no fluttering eyelids. Nothing to suggest that what she'd witnessed was anything more than a trick of the light or her own exhausted mind playing cruel games. But deep down, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Father Michael's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. He returned from his phone call, concern etched across his face. "I've spoken with the funeral director. They're sending someone over right away to verify everything." She nodded absently, her focus still locked on the coffin. Her hands trembled in her lap, and she clenched them tightly, trying to steady herself. "Thank you," she murmured softly, though her voice lacked conviction. Father Michael hesitated, clearly unsure how to comfort her. "Try not to worry too much until we know for certain," he said gently. "Sometimes grief can make us see things differently than they are." Margaret wanted to believe him, to convince herself that this was all some terrible misunderstanding, brought on by exhaustion and sorrow. But the memory of that flicker lingered, gnawing at the edges of her sanity. She couldn't ignore it. Not when every fiber of her being screamed that something unnatural was happening. Time seemed to crawl as they waited for the funeral director to arrive. The church grew quieter, the only sounds coming from the faint rustle of fabric as mourners outside prepared for the burial procession. Margaret sat rigidly beside the coffin, her gaze never wavering. She felt like a sentinel, guarding against whatever secrets this body might hold. Finally, footsteps echoed through the church. A middle-aged man in a dark suit entered, flanked by an assistant carrying a clipboard. His name tag read Gregory Hayes, and his demeanor exuded professionalism mixed with practiced empathy. "I'm sorry to hear about your loss, Mrs. Caldwell," Gregory said, offering a polite nod. "Father Michael mentioned there may be some concerns about—" He glanced at the coffin, then back at her. "The identification process?" "Yes," Margaret replied quickly, her voice trembling. "That's not my son in there. I don't know who it is, but it's not Ethan." Gregory raised an eyebrow but maintained his composure. "Let me take a closer look," he said calmly. "We'll sort this out together." He gestured for his assistant to open the coffin fully, revealing the entire body. Margaret instinctively leaned forward, her heart pounding as she scrutinized every detail. Gregory studied the corpse carefully, checking for distinguishing marks or tattoos that might confirm its identity. After several tense moments, he turned back to her. "Based on our records, this is indeed Ethan Caldwell," he stated firmly. "The body matches the description provided by the coroner's office." "But it's not him," Margaret insisted, her voice rising. "Look at his scar, or lack of one. My son had freckles on his cheeks and his hair wasn't styled like this." Gregory frowned slightly, glancing at his assistant, who shrugged helplessly. "I understand this must be difficult," he said diplomatically. "But unless there's concrete evidence suggesting otherwise, I assure you, this is the correct individual." Margaret opened her mouth to argue further, but the words died on her lips. Out of the corner of her eye she saw it again, a slight twitch of the fingers. This time it was unmistakable. Before anyone could react, the hand moved again, slowly curling into a loose fist. Gasps filled the room as everyone stared in stunned silence. Gregory stumbled backward, nearly knocking over his assistant. Father Michael crossed himself instinctively, muttering a prayer under his breath. And Margaret? She felt her world tilt on its axis. The body in the coffin wasn't dead. The room fell eerily silent, save for the sharp intake of breaths and the faint rustle of fabric as everyone instinctively took a step back. Margaret stood frozen, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure it echoed through the church. Her eyes were glued to the coffin, where the figure inside, once perfectly still, now moved with deliberate slowness. The hand that had curled into a loose fist began to unclench, fingers stretching outward as if testing their range of motion. Gregory, the funeral director, looked visibly shaken, his professional composure crumbling before their eyes. This isn't possible," he stammered, clutching the edge of the coffin as though afraid it might come alive too. His assistant stood rooted to the spot, clipboard clutched tightly against her chest, her face pale with disbelief. Father Michael stepped forward cautiously, his voice steady but tinged with awe. "Dear Lord, guide us in this moment," he whispered, raising a trembling hand to make the sign of the cross. His presence offered little comfort. Even he seemed unsure how to process what was unfolding before them. Margaret, however, couldn't look away. Despite her fear, a strange sense of hope flickered within her. If this body wasn't dead, if it could move, then maybe there was more to the story than anyone understood. Maybe Ethan wasn't truly gone after all. Slowly, painfully, the figure's eyelids began to flutter. At first, they twitched sporadically, like someone caught between sleep and wakefulness. Then, with agonizing effort, they opened fully, revealing glassy, unfocused eyes. The gaze swept across the room, seemingly unaware of its surroundings. "Ethan," Margaret breathed, her voice barely audible. She leaned closer, her hands pressed against the edge of the coffin. "Ethan, is that you?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it let out a low groan, deep and guttural, sending chills down everyone's spines. It sounded less like a human voice and more like something primal, raw, and otherworldly. Gregory backed away further, nearly tripping over his own feet. I need to call someone," he muttered, fumbling for his phone. This isn't normal." "No!" Margaret snapped, turning toward him with surprising ferocity. "Don't you dare leave. You brought him here. You're responsible for figuring out what's going on." Her words hung heavy in the air, silencing any protests. Gregory hesitated, clearly torn between fleeing and doing his job. Reluctantly, he stayed put, though his wide-eyed expression betrayed his unease. Meanwhile, the figure in the coffin continued to stir. Its head tilted slightly, as if trying to focus on Margaret. For a fleeting moment, recognition seemed to flash in its eyes, or at least, that's what Margaret wanted to believe. "Mom." The word was soft, barely audible, but it sent shockwaves through the room. Margaret's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor beside the coffin, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan? Oh my God, Ethan!" But before she could reach out to touch him, Father Michael intervened, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "Wait," he cautioned gently. "We don't know what's happening here. We need to be careful." His caution was warranted. As the figure attempted to sit up, its movements were jerky and unnatural, as though its muscles hadn't been used in years. Its arms trembled under its own weight, and its legs shifted awkwardly beneath the burial shroud. Margaret ignored the priest's warning, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said soothingly, reaching out again. "You're safe now. I'm here." For a brief moment, it seemed as though Ethan might respond. His lips parted, forming silent words. But then his body convulsed violently, and a loud, rasping sound erupted from his throat, a noise that was neither speech nor breath but something altogether alien. Everyone recoiled in horror. "What's happening to him?" Margaret cried, panic rising in her voice. Before anyone could answer, the figure's movements grew more erratic. Its hands clawed at the air, its head lolling from side to side, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The figure went limp, collapsing back into the coffin with a dull thud. Its eyes rolled shut and silence enveloped the room once more. Margaret stared in stunned disbelief, her mind racing. What had just happened? Was her son truly coming back, or was something darker at play? The church was deathly quiet, save for the sound of Margaret's ragged breathing. She knelt beside the coffin, her trembling hands hovering over Ethan's still form as if afraid to touch him again. Her mind raced with conflicting emotions, hope, fear, confusion, all swirling together in a chaotic storm. Was this a miracle? A cruel trick of fate? Or something far beyond her understanding? Father Michael stood nearby, his brow furrowed in deep thought. He had seen many strange things in his years as a priest, but nothing like this. His faith told him to trust in divine intervention, yet even he couldn't ignore the unsettling nature of what had just occurred. "Margaret," he said softly, breaking the silence, "we need to think carefully about what comes next." She turned to him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "What do you mean? That was Ethan. He spoke to me. Don't you see? He's alive." Alive? Gregory interjected sharply, his voice tinged with disbelief. That thing isn't alive. It's not natural. People don't come back from the dead, they just don't. His words hung heavily in the air, cutting through Margaret's fragile hope. She glared at him, anger flaring despite her exhaustion. Then explain what we just saw. Explain why my son moved, why he spoke. Gregory opened his mouth to respond but quickly closed it, clearly at a loss. Instead, he exchanged a nervous glance with his assistant, who looked equally shaken. Neither of them had an answer, not one that made sense anyway. Father Michael stepped forward, attempting to mediate. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he said firmly. "We need to approach this calmly and rationally. Whatever is happening here, we owe it to Ethan and to ourselves to find out the truth." Margaret nodded reluctantly, though her hands remained clenched into fists. "Fine. So what do we do now?" "We call for help," Father Michael replied. "Someone who can make sense of this. A doctor, perhaps, or someone trained in dealing with unusual circumstances." Gregory hesitated before pulling out his phone. "I'll contact the coroner's office," he muttered. "They'll want to know about this immediately." As Gregory stepped aside to make the call, Margaret leaned closer to the coffin once more. Her gaze lingered on Ethan's face, searching for any sign of life. His features were eerily calm now, almost serene, as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. Yet she knew better. Something inside him, the spark that had briefly flickered to life, had retreated, leaving behind only questions. Minutes passed in tense silence until Gregory returned, his expression grim. "The coroner is on their way," he announced. "But they're bringing someone else too, a specialist of some kind. They didn't say much, just that this situation requires extra attention." "A specialist?" Margaret echoed, her voice tinged with suspicion. "What kind of specialist?" "They didn't specify," Gregory admitted. "But given how strange this is, I suspect they're sending someone who deals with anomalies." The word sent a shiver down everyone's spines. Anomalies. It implied something outside the realm of normalcy, something science struggled to explain. Father Michael crossed himself again, whispering a silent prayer under his breath. "Whatever happens next," he said aloud, addressing the group, "we must remain vigilant. This could be a blessing, or it could be something else entirely." Margaret swallowed hard, her resolve wavering. She wanted desperately to believe that Ethan's awakening was a miracle, proof that love and faith could conquer even death itself. But doubt gnawed at her, fueled by the unnaturalness of it all. Why had he convulsed so violently? Why had he fallen unconscious again so suddenly? And most importantly, what would happen when he woke up next? Her thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of approaching footsteps. Moments later, two figures entered the church. A middle-aged woman dressed in a lab coat, flanked by a younger man carrying a medical bag. Both wore serious expressions, their eyes scanning the room with clinical precision. "I'm Dr. Evelyn Hart," the woman introduced herself briskly. "And this is my assistant, Daniel. We've been briefed on the situation. Show us the body." Margaret bristled at the term body, but she stepped aside nonetheless, allowing the doctor access to the coffin. Dr. Hart wasted no time, examining Ethan thoroughly while Daniel took notes. After several minutes of silence, Dr. Hart straightened up, her expression unreadable. "This case is unlike anything I've ever encountered," she admitted. "But one thing is certain, this individual is not fully deceased." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. Dr. Hart hesitated before answering. "It means your son exists in a state between life and death, a liminal space. How or why remains unclear. But if we're going to understand what's happening, we'll need to run tests. Extensive ones." Margaret felt her world tilt once more. Between life and death? What did that even mean? Dr. Evelyn Hart's words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating yet impossible to ignore. Margaret stared at her, struggling to process what she had just heard. Between life and death? How could such a thing exist? It sounded more like something out of a storybook than reality. Yet here they were, standing around a coffin containing a figure who defied every law of nature. "What do you mean, between life and death?" Margaret finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Hart adjusted her glasses, her expression calm but distant. "It's a rare phenomenon," she explained carefully, choosing her words with precision. "In some cases, individuals can enter what we call a liminal state, a kind of suspended animation where the body appears deceased, but certain biological functions continue at minimal levels. Think of it as being neither fully alive nor completely gone." "But why would that happen?" Father Michael asked, his tone cautious. "Is it medical, psychological, or something else?" "That's what we need to determine," Dr. Hart replied. She gestured toward Daniel, who began unpacking equipment from his bag, monitors, wires, and small devices that looked both advanced and intimidating. "We'll run tests to measure brain activity, heart function, and other vital signs. Until then, all we can do is speculate." Margaret stepped forward, her eyes pleading. "Please tell me, is he suffering? Can he feel anything?" The doctor hesitated before answering. "Based on initial observations, I don't believe so. His movements earlier seemed involuntary, almost reflexive. But until we gather more data, I can't say for sure." Her response offered little comfort. Margaret wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold back tears. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was trapped, caught in some kind of purgatory between worlds. As Daniel set up the equipment, Dr. Hart turned her attention back to the group. "I should warn you," she said gravely. "This situation is highly unusual. If my suspicions are correct, your son may not be alone. There have been isolated reports of similar cases throughout history, though none have ever been conclusively proven." "Reports?" Gregory echoed, his face pale. "What kind of reports?" "Stories of people returning after death," Dr. Hart admitted. "Some claim these individuals wake up unchanged. Others describe them as different, changed somehow. In many cases, their return has been accompanied by strange occurrences, phenomena science can't explain." Father Michael crossed himself again, his lips moving silently as he prayed. Even he, a man of faith, seemed unsettled by the implications. Margaret felt as though the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. "Are you saying Ethan might not come back the same person?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's too early to say," Dr. Hart replied gently. "But yes, it's possible. Whatever force brought him back, it may have altered him in ways we can't predict." The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. Margaret glanced back at the coffin, her heart torn between hope and dread. She wanted nothing more than to see Ethan smile again, to hear his laugh fill the church. But if doing so meant risking losing him forever, or worse, finding someone unrecognizable in his place, was it worth it? Daniel finished setting up the equipment and began attaching sensors to Ethan's body. Wires snaked across the coffin, connecting him to monitors that beeped softly, displaying jagged lines and numbers that meant little to anyone but the specialists. "This will take time," Dr. Hart said, watching the readings closely. "We need to monitor his condition over several hours to gather meaningful data." Margaret nodded numbly, sinking into a nearby pew. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. Why had this happened to Ethan? Was it random chance, or was there a deeper purpose behind it? And most importantly, what would happen next? As the hours dragged on, the atmosphere in the church grew tense. The monitors continued their rhythmic beeping, offering no immediate clarity. Dr. Hart and Daniel conferred quietly, jotting down notes and adjusting settings. Meanwhile, Margaret sat motionless, her gaze fixed on Ethan's face. Then, without warning, the monitors spiked. Beeps turned into a rapid staccato, drawing everyone's attention. "Doctor." Hart rushed to the equipment, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Something's changing," she muttered under her breath. Ethan's eyelids twitched. Margaret bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Ethan?" she called out, her voice cracking with emotion. "Can you hear me?" His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then locking onto hers. For a moment, recognition flickered in them. Mom. This time his voice was clearer, steadier. But before Margaret could respond, his expression shifted. His gaze darkened, becoming distant and cold. And then, he spoke again, not to her, but to someone unseen. "They're waiting for me." The words hung in the air like a chill that seeped into everyone's bones. "They're waiting for me." Ethan's voice was soft but carried an eerie detachment, as though he were speaking from somewhere far away. His eyes remained locked on a point beyond the church walls, gazing at something, or someone, only he could see. Margaret felt her heart shatter all over again. This wasn't her son. Not completely. Something had changed within him, twisting his familiar features into a mask of unfamiliarity. She reached out instinctively, her hand trembling as it hovered near his cheek. "Ethan, who's waiting for you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his lips curled into a faint smile, one that sent shivers down Margaret's spine. It wasn't the warm, comforting grin she remembered. It was colder, almost knowing. "The others," he whispered finally, his tone distant. "They've been calling me since the accident." "What others?" Father Michael interjected, stepping closer despite the unease radiating off him. "Where are they, Ethan? Can you tell us?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, his gaze shifting to the priest. For a moment it seemed as though he might answer, but then his expression hardened and he turned away, muttering under his breath. Words slipped past his lips, fragments of sentences that made no sense. Beyond the veil. Not ready yet. Too late for some. Dr. Hart exchanged a concerned glance with Daniel, who quickly jotted down notes. "His brain activity is spiking unpredictably," she murmured, studying the monitors. "It's unlike anything I've ever seen before." Gregory stood frozen near the doorway, gripping the frame so tightly his knuckles turned white. "This isn't right," he muttered, shaking his head. "None of this is right." Margaret ignored them, focusing solely on Ethan. Her maternal instincts screamed at her to pull him back, to anchor him to this world, but she didn't know how. "Ethan, please," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Come back to me. Stay with me." He blinked slowly, his focus returning briefly to her. For a fleeting second, the boy she loved, the one who used to laugh and bake cookies at midnight, shone through. "Mom," he said softly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "I can't stay." Not anymore. Her knees buckled and she collapsed onto the floor beside the coffin. "Why not? Why are you leaving me again?" "It's not my choice," he replied, his words heavy with regret. "Something pulled me back, to say goodbye, to warn you." "Warn us about what?" Father Michael asked urgently, leaning forward. Ethan's gaze swept across the room, lingering on each person before settling on Margaret once more. "There's a price," he said quietly, "for crossing between worlds. Some things aren't meant to return, not fully. If I stay, I'll change, become something else." A sob escaped Margaret's throat. "But if you go, I'll lose you forever." He reached out weakly, his fingers brushing hers. The touch was cold, but undeniably real. "You haven't lost me," he whispered. "I'll always be with you, in your memories, in your heart. Just let me go." Before anyone could respond, the monitors began to flatline. Ethan's body went limp, his hand slipping from Margaret's grasp. The room fell silent except for the sound of her anguished cries. Dr. Hart rushed to check his vitals, but it was clear. Whatever spark had brought him back had faded. This time there was no movement, no flicker of life. Father Michael placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder as she clung to the edge of the coffin, weeping uncontrollably. "He's at peace now," the priest murmured gently. As the group prepared to close the coffin once more, Margaret noticed something tucked beneath Ethan's folded hands. A small, crumpled note. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she read the single line scrawled inside. "Love bridges even the widest divides." Tears blurred her vision as she clutched the note to her chest. Though Ethan was gone, His final message filled her with a bittersweet sense of closure. He had returned, not to frighten or confuse, but to remind her that love endured beyond death itself. And as the mourners gathered outside for the burial, Margaret realized something profound. Ethan hadn't truly left her. His presence lingered in every memory, every act of kindness he'd shared during his life. In that moment, she vowed to honor him by living fully and loving deeply, for as long as she drew breath.